This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hi, this is Stacey Clardy from the Salt Lake City VA and the University of Utah. Today on the Neurology podcast, we're joined by Elisabeth Bick and Matthew Schrag for the first part of a three-part series on research integrity and research misconduct. Elisabeth and Matthew are both part of a small, very active group of individuals who are working to maintain scientific integrity by reviewing peer-reviewed scientific literature. And chances are, if you have read a story about scientific research integrity over the past few years, they were likely involved in the investigation. Elisabeth, by training, is a microbiologist. Having gotten her PhD in that field, she's previously done research at a number of organizations throughout the Netherlands and also in the U.S., including NIH and Stanford. Matthew is currently a practicing vascular neurologist at Vanderbilt and also a researcher on cerebral amyloid angiopathy and its contribution to cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's disease. I'm very excited that we have you on. I've been thinking about this for quite a long time as I've followed your work. I want to start by asking each of you how you found yourself doing this. I don't imagine that either of you pursued PhDs in research with the ultimate goal of rooting out scientific fraud. So for each of you, what was the experience, the moment in time, if there was one, that set you down this path? Elisabeth, let's start with you.
I heard about science integrity and plagiarism in particular. This is how it started. And I decided to put a sentence that I had written in a review paper into Google Scholar between quotes. And I had not expected to find anything, but I found that somebody had plagiarized a paragraph I had written and put it into their paper. And I was so mad. Like I had written that sentence. And so I started searching on plagiarism. And a couple of months later, I found by accident a duplicated figure where a photo had been used twice in two different papers, but representing two different experiments. And the photo had been mirrored also. So that looked also like it had been done deliberately. And I realized I apparently can see these duplications in photos, perhaps a little bit better than the average person. And I started searching for those duplications and never stopped since.
Wow, so personal experience. Obviously, the sentence you typed in, you must have felt was quite unique and had spent a long time crafting it. And then to find it elsewhere, yeah, I could see how that would spark the initial interest and passion in this. And Matthew, did you have a similar moment?
I think practicing as a physician, but also as a physician scientist, I think most of us probably have encountered issues related to research misconduct at one point or another. And to tell you the truth, I think a lot of us choose to mind our own business, especially if it's not that serious or not too close to home. But a case was brought to my attention a number of years ago where the problems were used to justify a clinical trial. And I got to tell you, as a doctor, that just hit me right between the eyes, that you would ask not just one or two patients, but hundreds and hundreds of patients to submit to human experimentation on the basis of what in retrospect appears to be fraudulent justifications, to me was just deeply offensive. And so I engaged publicly for the first time because of that, because of how it was impacting patients. I certainly didn't expect or intend for this to become a major part of my life. The problem when you pull on these strings, though, is that they keep pulling and pulling. You find another case that you just say, well, this one's also special. This one I can't walk away from because of X, Y, or Z. And it's turned into a bigger issue. But as a translational neuroscientist, we've always had this view that we don't specialize in studying one technique or one cell type or one mouse. We follow the idea of a scientific question, and you learn whatever tools you need to learn to chase that idea and hopefully chase it all the way to a treatment or a cure for a disease. That's the goal of a translational scientist. And I felt like we got to a point where I saw research integrity as being a major barrier for our field in terms of reaching a serious treatment for Alzheimer's disease, that this was an impediment to our field accomplishing what we were all trying to accomplish. And I think that's when I decided that it had to be a big part of what I was going to do, at least for the short term, to try to get this field back on track.
even if someone's involved in misconduct in a paper that seems so very basic science oriented, one never knows where that's going to go. And it may ultimately lead to something that's translational and ends up in clinical trials. Yeah, I hear you loud and clear. That's heartbreaking.
And we've seen that in so many of these cases. You see something that looks trivial. Everybody's, who cares about Western blots? And it's because these things turn into clinical trials and they affect patients.
Yeah, and trust is such a huge issue as it is between the scientific and medical communities and the public. And on the one hand, there's also these conspiracy theories, but how can one hope to combat sort of the conspiracy theories of the modern if there's no trust in the first place because there's problems from within, right?
Absolutely agree with that.
And along those lines, as you said, you've started pulling on these strings and it's revealing things you didn't expect, and it's not a one-time endeavor. So how has this work affected your lives? You are both obviously not making friends with some folks here, some arguably very powerful people, often in academia and the institutions themselves. How have you handled this? Have you received threats? Have you lost relationships? Let me start with you on that one, Elisabeth.
Yeah, I have lost some friendships, especially at my work. When I still worked in academia and I started doing this work, I noticed that a lot of my coworkers were starting to avoid me and be a little bit mad, saying, why do you report these cases of plagiarism or image duplications? Because these are nice folks. We work with them. We know them. They're in our own field. And I said, but it's plagiarism. It's bad. I don't care if it's a nice person. I'm going to report it. Yeah, I definitely noticed that some people were trying to avoid me after that. And also in legal aspects, I've received, this was a couple of years later when I started to upset some bigger egos. I've received some legal threats where people send me a cease and desist letter or filed complaints against me in France, which could result in a legal case. I have upset, I think, the Chinese government because I reported some cases about a Chinese immunologist who was very highly ranked. And so that story was banned in China, and some journalists couldn't talk to me about that. And that's all serious stuff. And the first cease and desist letter, when I got that scares you. You're not quite sure what is going to happen. Can you ignore it? Can you just not reply, or what do you do? And in the end, that one turned out not to be that serious. But later I've received a subpoena. And so all these things are very serious and very different than I was trained for as a scientist. And they eat on you personally. I've been harassed on social media, mainly Twitter, received some nasty emails. So there were definitely times where I thought maybe I should stop doing this, but I still have this internal drive to keep on going because I feel it's important and I need to do it.
I'm glad that you do continue to do it, but I feel that's a lot. That's a lot of sleepless nights. That's a lot of...
Yes, for sure.
Honestly, it's probably at a cost to you as well. Now all of a sudden you have to seek legal advice.
Absolutely.
Matthew, I hope to say that you haven't experienced the same thing, but I have a feeling that is probably not what you're going to tell me.
It's a big decision to do this kind of work because you don't know where it's going to end and what the full length of the ramifications are going to be. Like Elisabeth, I've also had to deal with some legal issues related to this. And it's interesting because when you're dealing with well-funded individuals or entities, even if they don't have a legal case against you, they can still use the legal system to punish you. They can submit subpoenas against you. They can be enormously invasive, time-consuming, require you to produce thousands and thousands of pages of documents and the metadata to go along with those documents. And that is not something that most people are capable of doing on their own. And so you have to have legal representation to deal with these things. It can be very expensive, extraordinarily expensive. This is not work that is, in general, supported by universities, right? This is something that we do on our own, and so it can take a significant toll on your family. It can affect your family's security. I remember somebody coming to my house to serve papers in the middle of the night, parking in a dark corner of the back of our driveway and scaring the willies out of my family. I think these are the things that you don't necessarily think about on the front end and are very real issues, not just for me professionally, but also for my family. I will say, however, that I have been impressed with the degree of support that we've received. I think that my colleagues in general have been remarkably supportive, with a few exceptions. And I think also as my legal expenses rose, we also found that there were people who were willing to step up and help with that. And so at some point, a group of philanthropists who run something called the Scientific Integrity Fund came to assist with some of those expenses, and that really helped to put my mind at ease as we were working through these issues. And so I'm grateful for the individuals who've decided to be part of protecting people who are in this situation. I think that's very important. But I do agree with Elisabeth that this is a fraught area. There are certainly fairly regular threats, none of which have materialized, fortunately.
Wow. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that some folks truly value, as we all should, what you're doing enough to put their money where their mouth is. What, for each of you, have you felt has been the most dangerous situation that this work has landed you in, Elisabeth?
I guess the subpoena that I received was dangerous in that I wasn't quite sure if that was going to financially ruin me, or if that would result in a lawsuit. And so far, things are good. I haven't heard anything. But yeah, it makes you think, should I do this? I also think that the situation with the Chinese immunologist was potentially dangerous because the Chinese government decided to ban the story. So people talking about it on Chinese social media sites, their accounts were suspended. And people were saying that I might also be at risk of being attacked. For example, I could lose my Twitter account or my email, or maybe financial things got hacked. And so that sounded very serious. Luckily, that didn't happen, but it just, I put up some protective measures. And I worry sometimes about my personal safety. One time somebody in France posted my personal address online, and I was just worried that somebody would come to my house and enter my house or try to damage it or damage me. And none of that has ever happened, but I just am worried about that sometimes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd been doxxed, right? That's what they call it, this truly awful sort of form of intimidating one about their personal safety by posting personal information. Matthew, similar or different?
I think the most difficult and the most personal issue that arose was that my very first research mentor became entangled in these sorts of problems. Was probably the most difficult thing, and that's where it can cost you relationships that are very personal. These names at the top of a paper are often a lot more than just people who got thrown together to work together. These are often people who have gotten to know each other very well and have close relationships, and that's certainly how I felt about him. And to find dozens and dozens of papers had been altered in unethical ways in the work of somebody that I cared about so much, I think it was probably the most difficult thing that I had gone through. And obviously that becomes very personal. That comes close to home and affects a wide range of relationships. And so I think that's where the cost often lies, is in how it affects relationships.
With that answer you hit on, I think, what is maybe so subconsciously terrifying about all of this to anyone in science or research, and that is the question in the back of everyone's mind: have I collaborated with, or have I unwittingly been involved in this?
I think this is probably the most important thing we talk about today, because science has become so collaborative. And a lot of the things that we work on are fairly complex, and it's not unusual in a group of scientists working together for not every individual who's named on the paper to be able to technically take responsibility for all of the data in that paper. So what happens if you're tangled up in this? And I honestly think there's a really easy but simultaneously difficult answer to that. And that's, before it ever happens to you, you have to decide that you're going to deal with that problem when it arises. You need to decide now, today, that when that happens, you're going to be part of the solution. that retractions are not the end of the world, that corrections or whatever needs to happen to set the scientific record right has to come before relationships, before ego, and that if this happens to you, you have to have the confidence that your career will survive and in fact will be better if you take a stand for scientific integrity. So I think every co-author, instead of running and hiding or trying to put the issue in a desk drawer saying that's somebody else's problem, should step up and say, not with my name on it. If my name is on it, it's going to be right.
Yeah, there's the lesson right there. Look, you're both busy with this, like unbelievably busy now, from just me casually reading the trade mags and the media. And Elisabeth, as I understand it, you now provide consulting on scientific integrity. So who are your clients? I am imagining the demand for this service may grow exponentially. I'm not sure what insights you have.
It's actually not growing that much. I don't do that much consulting. I mainly travel around the world. I get invited to talk about these cases, about science integrity in general, but that is mostly for universities, department series, seminars, keynotes at conferences, and occasionally I do more real consulting work, which would be for publishers or journals or institutions, funders who are investigating individual allegations of misconduct. So they might hire me to look at specific allegations. So I'm not doing any regular work. It's based case by case. And it's actually not that much. I do think that there's now more knowledge within universities and scientific publishers on how to handle these cases. It could still be more, because sometimes you see these decisions where university says, oh, there was no misconduct. And I'm just looking at these photoshopped images and I just cannot understand how they came to that conclusion. This is clearly photoshopped. How can a university decide that there was no misconduct? And I think in a lot of cases, universities want to make it appear that misconduct doesn't happen within their walls. So that is frustrating. I do think there's a big need for experts like Matthew, myself, many others, looking at these cases, not just from an expert point of view, maybe a neurologist or a microbiologist, but from a fraud standpoint. Could this be fraud? And of course, the question, who has done it? That is a difficult one. That is one that the universities need to investigate. And that is much more complex than just looking at a paper and deciding that there is some photoshopping that happened. But I do wish that I was consulted a little bit more as a consultant for matters like these, as an expert. But it's not that often. So most of my work is traveling and giving talks about these topics, which I think is incredibly important because we need to make more people aware that there's fraud in science. And I think that knowing that will make people a little bit less gullible, a little bit less naive.
That brings to mind two things, what you've just said for me. An old mentor of mine, when I was starting out, discovered something I wasn't pleased with happening as a personnel issue at the university, reminded me that institutions are not individuals and we can't expect them to make the right choice. And in essence, the institution will always survive. I hear that in what you're saying about really just risk mitigation on the part of the institutions and perhaps not wanting to fully expose what's going on from a risk point of view. Frustrating, but reality, right? And then my second question, I guess, is perhaps it's good news then that it's not growing exponentially. And you've done work on this, right? We're talking about all the bad news here, but how common is this? Is this super common, in your opinion, the amount of misconduct? I think that I recall you did do some research on this in terms of what percentage of papers or studies are affected, right?
It is growing, yeah. So I did a search on 20,000 papers spanning 20 years in scientific publishing. This is an older study. It's already almost 10 years old. But yeah, we saw a sharp rise around 2004, where we saw many more images being manipulated, photoshopped, etc. And that probably coincides with the digitalization of scientific papers, where instead of going to your photographer down in the basement to make some photos of your gels and clipping the negatives or the positives onto your printed out manuscripts that you would send to the peer reviewers, you would now provide these files digitally. And with digitalization, where people could just, after a photo had been taken, could alter it a little bit, of course, then this started to be misused. So we did see a sharp rise around 2003 and 4 and 5. I also see a second rise, although I haven't really investigated that scientifically, but we just see this tsunami of fake papers that are now being sent out to publishers. And most of these actually seem to have made it through peer review. And these come from countries where people are hoping for a better future, maybe scientists who love to have a paper, and they see these advertisements online where they can become a co-author on a paper that they did not write themselves. So these advertisements are placed by scammers. We call them paper mills. And these scientific paper millers just churn out paper after paper, low quality, maybe AI, helped with AI to write papers that are not really written by humans. Some of these papers are completely fake. They might have AI generated images. They might have plagiarized text that is synonymized by either translating it in another language and then translating it back in English. They follow a variety of techniques, but that is enormously on the rise, I would say, in the past 10 years. So the scientific integrity issues are not just individual fraudsters, like one lab, one bad apple. These are professional scammers that will write or generate fake paper after fake papers. And this is so much on the rise that I'm very worried about how can we distinguish good papers from bad papers, because there's now this enormous amount of these paper mill written papers. And that is, I think, the real problem that not just we as science integrity folks, but publishers and institutions should worry about.
I think that is a really important summary. One of the things that I also like to highlight is that when you hear that it's a couple of % of papers that may be affected, it's easy to think that that's a small problem. But when you have the opportunity to idealize information, you can insert critical pieces of data at key nodes in the way we think about problems. Even though it's certainly not the majority of papers, it can alter the way we think about things. And then these ideas become heavily cited. Some of the papers that we've talked about have been cited hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of times. And so those ideas can propagate through the literature and create a much bigger problem.
Yeah, and certainly on a smaller scale, I have nowhere near the expertise of either of you, but I'm a journal reviewer and abstract reviewer. And what you said, Elisabeth, has hit home too with me. I've found a couple of cases of this. It's because something just hits you, right? Something hits you that something's not quite right. And I can recall one in particular for some abstract where I did a bit of Googling, because one doesn't like to leverage those sorts of accusations just based on a gut feeling. And I found it was really a predatory practice of people, young clinicians who would hope to come to the US, in this case, to do training. And I found actually on LinkedIn, ultimately, this predatory service offering to help them write a paper. And so obviously 2 or 3 of these folks had used this service to mine sort of a database and publish on it. And it kind of broke my heart in a way, because as you said, they were clearly trying to get a better opportunity. And I don't know that there was actually a problem with the data. I don't think there was, but I think it was a problem with how it was generated in that case. And it was truly disturbing to me that they were being taken advantage of. And it was this terribly gray area that, as you two can probably attest to, leads quickly, potentially then, to this pattern with much greater ramifications as well.
And you cannot blame those folks. I think a lot of people who are, let's say, not in North America, not in Europe, and are scientists, they would love to come to those countries and do a postdoc, but they don't have enough papers. They might not have resources or funding to do research in their own country. You cannot blame them from wanting a better future. But yeah, these folks might buy an authorship on these papers and then make their resume look a little bit better and then come to other countries, but they don't have the knowledge to actually write papers. And so very often these folks might not be successful in their career later on. And of course, I don't approve of this practice of just putting your name on a paper that you didn't write. Papers are where you show that you've done the research, that you are good in writing, that you can think like a scientist. And the work that you present in these papers is work that other people will build on. So this whole practice of producing fake papers is ruining that system. we scientists should be able to trust each other. So if I see something wrong in a paper that I think might hint that it might be written by a paper mill, I will report these papers. But there is always a sad story about each of these cases where folks just wanted to have a better future, where people work in labs, where big egos are forcing them to perhaps Photoshop the results that a professor wanted. I'm always respectful for the people, the names on these papers, but we need to be taking a hard stance against science misconduct itself.
Absolutely. This is such incredibly important work that you're both doing to preserve the foundation of scientific integrity on which all research and clinical practice is based. Also incredibly brave and at a significant personal cost. Thank you so much. We will be back in part 2 to discuss more of the logistics of how this work is done and how to address this if it affects any of our listeners, anyone who's conducting research or mentoring clinician researchers. So tune back in for the next in our series. Thank you for this, Elisabeth and Matthew. This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review the Neurology podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can always head to neurology.org/podcast for our full list of past episodes. Or you can also search by keyword in your podcast app for any neurology-specific topics you want to learn